Why is there suddenly this need for a different kind of leadership?
Just, it's deeply entrenched in the way we operate with not just each other in the organization, but also what our clients see in us.
Yes.
So, I can quite exactly be saying, as an organization, these are our values, but when I bump into the person at Shimmy Beach and they're carrying on like a little thing, it doesn't necessarily fit.
Yeah, for sure.
So I lose trust in that organization as well.
Yeah, and in that individual, right? Fantastic. And anyone else? Why is value-based leadership important in this context of future of work? Everybody's talking about the future of work. Yeah, go for it, Kim.
Because the millennials are coming. The millennials are here.
Millennials are here.
And they're coming thick and fast. And they love meaning, values. So that's why we need to be awake.
Yeah, and not just the millennials, the Z generation.
Oh.
Yes, go for it.
Yeah, we've got a lot of stereotypes millennials quite a bit, but I think there's also throughout people's careers.
Yes.
And we reach a point where we think more about work and fulfilling a purpose. And we're in now this maelstrom of change through technology and all the things around us. So values give us a beacon to follow while we've got to make decisions around a lot of other things.
Spot on. Sorry, I didn't catch your name? Mike. So Mike, I love that you mentioned purpose here, because there is a huge connection between values and the purpose of the organization as well, and that idea around a decision-making framework that you just mentioned. So we'll get into that in a bit more detail. So, hang on a second. And the reality is that the world of work is changing. People no longer want to work for organizations that just focus on profit. I think Mark mentioned it. It's about creating shared value. It's about sustainability. It's about purpose and meaning. More and more, we're seeing purpose-driven organizations are succeeding, and it's because people can get behind it. They can get behind what is the purpose of the organization. They want to be part of it. They want to be there every day. And there's a good set of leaders that are holding the fort. And there's a way of behaving within the organization that drives success. And it's changing. People are wanting more. And they're looking to create value in order to build profit, and not the other way around. So there's this idea that leadership needs to change, and that a value-based leader will be one that focuses on their core values and this alignment of personal values with organizational values. That a value-based leader will put the well-being of the employees and the public at the center of the organization. That they will listen carefully to their employees and customers and become people-centric in their decision-making. Most importantly, that they will lead by example so that people can follow them, just like we saw in the Enron case. It doesn't matter what people say. The leaders of companies, it spreads like wildfire. The leadership team displays the behavior, and people either respect it and follow it, or it can become a toxic environment. So we need leaders that are looking to incorporate their values into their business models, into their strategy of the organization, and to really start thinking about how they create values for society. So value for employees, value for customers, not just value for stakeholders. And how do we start thinking about sustainability and purpose? And most importantly here, this idea of continuous learning. If you look at all the research at the moment about future of work, the one thing that's standing out is that leaders who are not upskilling themselves or continuously learning or evolving, especially in the space of emotional intelligence and self-regulation and awareness, they're not going to keep up with the times. So there's some really interesting stuff happening there. But the reality of this is that all sounds fantastic, right? That sounds great. But the question is, how do we really get there? I mean, it sounds fantastic on paper, but that's the problem. Everybody's got it up on paper, but they're not really doing it, right? So that's what I really want to get into today. And before I go any further, the first step in this process is really about personal values. So just by a show of hands, I just want to see how many people here have actively thought about their personal values. Just like you know exactly what they are, okay? And how many people here use them to guide their daily decisions at home and at work consistently? Wow, I'm impressed. So the reality, did anyone have achievement that came up? Yeah? Yeah. So what's interesting, someone who maybe has achievement as a core value, compared to someone who has contentment, for example. The choices that they make in life, the career, the kind of things that they do are going to be very different. And it's really interesting when you start to reflect on this and start to ask yourself, but is this actually my value? Or is this, did I somewhere along the line pick up this value? Is this the life that I want to be leading? Or what's going on here? So this goes a lot deeper. And I think it's really important to actually understand it, because once I think Roy Disney says it best here, it's not hard to make decisions once you know what your values are. I don't know about you, but often in life I struggle to make certain decisions. And I always find that when I'm struggling the most to make a decision, it's because I'm not 100% clear on my values or how I feel about it. Should I be doing this? Shouldn't I be doing this? My gut's saying no, but I'm thinking maybe I should. It's because I'm not 100% clear. And once we begin to get really clear on our values, it starts to become a lot easier to make decisions. It becomes a framework for decision making. But it's in life, a personal life. It's about choosing the right partners. It's about choosing the right company to work for. It's about choosing the right people to be around. It starts to just kind of make everything in life a little bit clearer and a little bit easier, at least the decision making part of it. It definitely reduces the amount of dissonance that one feels on an average day. And what I find really interesting is that once we start to realize how our values and beliefs are actually developed over time through our life experiences, we also start to realize that the same things happen at organizations. So if an organization hasn't been intentional about the kind of culture it wants to create, or the kind of leaders that it wants to drive, and the kind of behaviors it wants its leaders to exemplify, it can sometimes build unintentionally, and that's where you can sometimes end up in a very toxic situation, and sometimes a great situation. You often see in a lot of small startups, they seem to have this fantastic culture and everyone's aligned, but as soon as they begin to grow, it starts to come out in the woodwork. And that's why it's all about getting into how we embed it into every system and process, which we're going to get to. So the reason why I'm making this point here is with clarity of intent, the vision becomes reality, is that once we get really clear about what we actually, the kind of behaviors that we want to display in our organization, the kind of culture we want to create, it becomes a lot easier to get there. So for me, values-based leadership is the foundation. So it's the foundation of an organization, and values are really at the heart of it. So values-based leadership is about understanding your personal values, organizational values, and making the connection. But I strongly think there's a layer on top of this, because the reality is that values-based leadership isn't that new. All around the world we see values up on the wall, or in the onboarding book. There's what's the values of this organization? Oh, there's a page somewhere about that. Okay, well then they're not really being lived in this organization, are they? And so I would actually argue that values aren't quite enough, and that there's a step on top of this, that layer that we need to build into it, and it's this layer is what starts to connect the dots between culture, leadership, and strategy. Book, okay, interesting. Who else? Google, yeah. Apple, Amazon, yeah. Who else? Virgin, okay, interesting. Okay, so I guess it actually does determine what we mean by the word successful, right? Which comes back to our values. But yes, I did mean this in the general sense of the word, who are the most kind of profitable, successful organizations at the moment. And I did choose Amazon, because I think that they are a very, very interesting case study. And so, does anyone hazard a guess, kind of, why is Amazon doing so well? Would anyone have any ideas? Petronia, not yet. We actually have someone from Amazon in the room. Anybody? Okay, so what's really interesting about Amazon is that they have 16 guiding leadership principles. And as you can see here, they say it's just one of the things that make Amazon peculiar. I would argue that it's not what makes them peculiar at all. I would actually argue it's the winning formula. And one of the winning formula, and there's many other things that they are doing there, but I would say that it's the way that they are connecting the dots between leadership, culture, and strategy. And so you'll see here, the only thing peculiar about it is that the rest of the world still undervalues the role of culture in business success. So it's so interesting. We have so many systems and processes and technology to manage our financial systems, our payroll, our processes, etc. But we don't seem to have anything for culture. And culture, if you think about the Enron case study, it rotted from the top of the leadership team, and then it spread throughout the organization. And it was the culture that destroyed the organization. The people became corrupt throughout, on all layers in that organization. And so what I find really interesting is this connection between principles and culture. And so the definition of culture is that organizational culture encompasses values and behaviors that contribute to the unique social and psychological environment of an organization. And then the definition of principles, a fundamental truth or proposition that serves as the foundation for a system of belief or behavior or for a chain of reasoning. And what I really wanted to point out here is the word behavior. You'll see the commonality between the two. Culture is about behavior, and principles is about behavior. And values are about behavior. So when values are up on the wall, and they're just on the wall or they're just on a piece of paper, and they don't have behaviors attached to them, they fall flat. And the same thing can be said for principles. So principles kind of takes this idea a step further, because principles starts to create a framework for making decisions. It's every organization who has a set of principles guides their leaders. So, and you'll see this, is anyone familiar with the organization called Bridgewater Associates? Does that ring a bell for anyone here? So it's one of the biggest financial management organizations in the States, and it's was founded by a guy called Ray Dalio in 1975. And Ray Dalio wrote a book called Principles, and it's all about how over his life, he's come up with this set of principles. And those principles guide his decision making. So they're kind of like this idea of a chain of reasoning. And he uses them in his organization. And he doesn't just use them to guide how he guides behavior of his leaders, but he's also using them to guide the strategy of the organization. And they're a hedge fund. I mean, they're doing stocks and so on. So it's very interesting to look into. But what's interesting is it's not just Amazon that's doing it. It's a lot of these forward-thinking companies are starting to suddenly realize that there's this huge connection between culture, leadership, and strategy. And how do we start to make the connection? How can we link it together? How can we align it? It's when we understand that behavior is the connection between these. So how do we start to begin to drive behavior? We don't underestimate the role of leadership. The role of leadership in organizations is critical. And this is what these organizations are doing. They're saying, you know what, we're in a VUCA world, right? VUCA stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, right? It's very difficult for leaders to lead in a space like that. And with so much uncertainty, they need some kind of certainty, something to guide their behavior. Trump, not a good example, but just kind of the irony there. But and I think the idea here is that they've realized that leadership actually influences culture, and culture, as we saw in the Enron case, can destroy strategy. And I mean, poor Peter Drucker has been trying to hammer this home for I don't know how long. Everyone's seen this before, right? Organizational culture eats strategy for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It really does. We've seen it sign off, we've seen it in Enron, we're seeing it in Icarus. The stories go on and on. You see it in organizations you're working all the time. What's one of the highest reasons why people leave companies? They leave managers most of the time. 50 Gallup study says, I think it's about 50% people leave people. They leave the managers or they leave the culture of the organization. And we can't underestimate the role of leadership in creating the culture of the organization. We're people at the end of the day. We want to work in an environment where we can thrive. And so that's at the crux of each other. The process is about aligning your culture, your values and your principles to your strategy so that they can direct it, and then they can drive your leadership behavior day in and day out so that people have a framework for making decisions. I find it fascinating that they're measuring it every single day. And what's so interesting about the way that they're measuring it is that it's measuring up on the leader. So do you know what pressure it is to be a leader in that environment? Because you are constantly, you are kept on your toes. Every day. I mean, it's not, I think that how it works is you're getting asked that question every day, but you can dive into it when you want to. But it's kind of consistently saying, How are you experiencing your leadership, your leader, basically? And so they're putting so much emphasis on that because they understand that leaders' behavior drives the culture of the organization, which will ultimately impact the strategy. Will we succeed or not succeed? It's fascinating stuff. And the whole idea is that you need to get really strategic about how you, so this is where it levels up. So, stage one is kind of understanding your values. And that's kind of the baseline, and knowing what kind of organization you want to be part of and so on. But the next step is, how do we really start setting principles that ensure that we are keeping in alignment with our strategy, and that we're building the right kind of culture that will ultimately help us reach our strategy.